Hi, everyone. It's Tuesday, January 15th, and we're almost midway through week two, so we're making good progress. Hope everybody's doing well. Um, uh, I was looking at the forum posts for yesterday, and I was really happy. I think everybody's doing a lot closer to what I had intended to in terms of using the going to the sources. So good work, everybody. So today, I'm not going to talk for very long, but I did want to talk a little bit about the source that I had posted on Moodle for today, and to talk a little bit about the forum posting. And the reason I want to talk about it is because I think I need to do a little bit of explaining so that you kind of get a sense of the context and the backstory for the question that I'm posing. I understand that the question that you read in the forum post is a fairly straightforward question, but there is a backstory to the question that I think is useful to understand as you're thinking about the sources and you're thinking about how you're going to answer it. So, our topic for today is women in the 1920s. And we could have focused on women in pretty much any era in American history. It would be worthwhile. And I really wanted to include a whole day on women in the 1960s and 1970s with the so-called second wave movement of feminism. As you'll see, we just ran out of time, but I wanted to have at least a full day talking about the experiences of American women, and I thought the 1920s was a good time to focus in on that because it's this interesting period in which the previous women's rights movement, what had been known as the women's rights movement up until the 1920s, had all been geared around essentially the suffrage question of getting women the right to vote. And after World War I, as you've seen from the O'Donnell lecture, and you probably knew anyway, with the 19th Amendment, women do gain the right to vote. So the reason the 1920s is kind of an interesting time period is because it's the first generation of women to have experienced the success of a women's rights movement. And it's also corresponding with rapidly shifting time in American social and cultural and political history, in the sense that the country is rapidly urbanizing. In fact, the federal census of 1920, for the first time, reveals the United States as a majority urban nation. And there are all sorts of new ideas coming from Europe, coming from the cities about modernism, about changing gender norms, about changing attitudes towards sexuality. We might point to a character like Sigmund Freud as influencing new ideas about sexuality. So this kind of collision of two things, the success of the 19th century women's rights movement in establishing suffrage, and the emergence of what historians call modernism, or the culture of modernism, changing gender norms, happening at the same time. So it's a compelling time to talk and to think about the lives of women, the experiences of women, and to deal with that. So what I specifically want to talk about is to give a little bit of context to that forum question. So what you'll see when you go into the forum post is a discussion around what was sort of the major proposal from the people who had been the veterans of the suffrage movement. In particular, a key character here is a woman named Alice Paul. Alice Paul was a young woman in the 19 teens who had led the most militant wing of the suffrage movement, and who many people credit with the sort of shocking theatrical protests that ultimately galvanized the Wilson administration to support suffrage. So Alice Paul is really sort of seen by many as the kind of the breakthrough figure in achieving suffrage. What's interesting in this case is that so Alice Paul leads the suffrage movement, sees suffrage go through, and then immediately starts thinking that suffrage is not enough, that there are going to be unresolved questions and issues, that simply having the vote isn't enough to guarantee equal rights for women across the country. So what Alice Paul proposes is that now that women are able to go to the ballot box, now that women are able to assert political power, the way that they should make their voice heard is to compel their legislators to adopt a constitutional amendment. All right, so we've already had one constitutional amendment granting women suffrage. Paul is saying we now need a second amendment, which she calls the Equal Rights Amendment. She proposes this in 1923. And the language of the Equal Rights Amendment is very simple. It essentially states that there shall not be any discrimination on the basis of sex. That's the proposal of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, why is this so important for Paul? Well, if we put the Equal Rights Amendment into the federal Constitution, then legal equality, which would be the basis of equal citizenship between men and women, would be the law all over the country. It's the uniform nature, the universality of a constitutional amendment that makes it so powerful. And Paul feels that in order to truly secure equal rights for women, the Constitution itself needs to state clearly that men and women are legal political equals, and that this would hold true in any part of the country. Now, there was opposition to the ERA. In fact, the ERA has never been added to the Constitution. There was a movement for it in the 20s. There was another major revitalization of the ERA movement in the 1970s. The ERA came very, very close, came within 3 states. It was 3 states away from being ratified in the Constitution in the 1970s before the movement ultimately failed. So it is not a part of the Constitution, though it's been continually debated. But in the course of at the time of the 1920s, nobody quite knew what to expect from newly enfranchised women. Nobody really, it was an untested political group. So there were plenty of politicians who thought that women now with the vote would be really motivated to support something like the ERA. So its failure in the 1920s was not preordained. But there was some opposition to the ERA, and this is what I want to explain. Now, some of the opposition to the ERA is exactly the kind of stuff that you would anticipate. It would have been the same sort of opposition that you would have heard about the suffrage movement. So people who were against suffrage felt that having women in the public business of politics threatened morality, it threatened the family life, it threatened to corrupt pure womanhood. A lot of those same arguments were made against the ERA. But those aren't the arguments that I'm interested in. And those aren't the arguments that you see in the sources on the source for Moodle. So here's what I want to explain a little bit. Why would women's rights activists, women in particular, who had been in the public sphere as political activists lobbying for women's causes throughout their lives, why would they oppose the Equal Rights Amendment? That's the core of the question. And that's why I think looking at the 20s illustrates that when we talk about women's history, it's a lot more complicated than simply having one camp over here and one camp over here. So let's talk about these women who were not conservatives by a traditional definition of that term. They were activists. They were very concerned with women's rights, but they were very skeptical and, in fact, opposed Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, so here's how this makes sense a little bit. A lot of the women who opposed the ERA, women who were women's rights activists who opposed the ERA, here was their background. A lot of them came out of state-level campaigns for women's rights, and in particular for what was called protective legislation or protective laws. And in particular, the people that they were concerned about protecting were women who worked for wages, wage-earning women who often worked in pretty difficult conditions. So if you're a 19-year-old, a 20-year-old woman working 12 hours a day in a laundry, for instance, and you've got your hands in toxic chemicals for 12 hours a day, these are very dangerous, difficult conditions. And they were the cause of concern of a lot of state-level women's rights activists. So what you'd seen throughout the tail end of the Progressive era were in a series of states like New York and Illinois in some states on the West Coast, a series of laws enacted at the state level that created specific protections for women workers as women. This was very controversial. It took ultimately a Supreme Court decision to ratify this. There's a very important Supreme Court decision from 1910 called Muller v. Oregon. The state of Oregon had passed a law that limited the workday of women to 10 hours. Keep in mind, there's no such thing as an 8-hour work. The 8-hour workday is a pipe dream at this point. There's the idea that a legislature could tell a worker you can only work a certain number of hours, or to tell an employer you can only work your workers for a certain number of hours. That was almost unthinkable. In fact, there had been a case in 1905 where the Supreme Court throws out a maximum hours law from New York that set a maximum hours law for male bakers in New York City. The law wanted to cap the work week at 60 hours. Compare that to our 40-hour work week. They wanted to cap the work week at 60 hours, and the Supreme Court said, nope, you can't do that. Well, the state of Oregon had passed a law to say, we don't want women to work in factories any more than 10 hours a day. And the reason that we don't want women, these are particularly young women, working in factories in often difficult conditions for more than 10 hours a day was specifically because they are, in the language of the Progressive Era, the mothers of the race. Women, young women, are going to be mothers. And so the state has an interest in protecting them. So Oregon had passed this law. This is challenged by an employer in Oregon. It goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, which had just said you can't have a 60-hour law for male bakers in New York, turns around and says, but you can have a law for women workers in Oregon. Now, what happens if the Equal Rights Amendment becomes federal law? If the Equal Rights, if there's a new constitutional amendment that says men and women are equal, that's what concerned a lot of these women's activists who had lobbied for women wage earners at the state level, because suddenly the ERA threatened to invalidate this whole course of what were called protective laws. So equality looks great as a theoretical abstract for Alice Paul, but what a lot of these women activists were saying was equality is, we don't want equality with men if equality with men means we work 70-hour weeks and endanger the future of the species and ruin motherhood. So when you see that forum question about, do we want equal citizenship or is the ERA a bad idea? That's the term of the debate that I want you to be thinking about. And that is exactly the terms of the debate that was at play in the Shepard-Towner Act, which was at the centerpiece of the article that you read after those primary sources. The Shepard-Towner Act it's not exactly a protective law, but it is a law that is specifically geared for women as women, because it was basically a maternal health law, a maternity law, a law to provide assistance, medical assistance, nutritional assistance to mothers. Now, obviously, that's not a law that could apply to men. It would affect men. Men would have various opinions about it, but it was a law that was specifically designed for women as mothers. The people who supported the Shepard-Towner Act would have taken a position on the ERA that would have been quite skeptical, because they would have seen the ERA as potentially invalidating the principles of something like this maternity bill, which from their perspective is what women really needed. So this is kind of an argument among women activists about, what do women really need? Do women need the support and protection of the state to enable them to be healthy, to enable them to be mothers, or do they need equal rights just like men? And that's essentially the terms of the debate. Incidentally, Shepard-Towner, even though it's coming from a different, essentially an anti-ERA perspective, was no more popular with conservatives than the ERA was. it's hard for us to kind of recreate how radical the Shepherd-Towner was from the course of the 1920s. But let's just keep in mind that this is an era before the New Deal. There is no such thing as a federal welfare state. So the fact that Shepherd-Towner created this national women's health infrastructure, at least for a while, was a pretty major departure. Okay, so that sort of sets out the parameters of the debate that I want you to think about for the forum. Before we go, I just want to say just a quick word about thinking about the general nature of women's lives in the 1920s, specifically because I'm sure when you think about women in the 1920s, the first thing that comes to your mind is the flapper. And I haven't totally discouraged you from doing this, because if you look at Moodle, there's the picture that I have there are the four flappers flagrantly drinking bottles of liquor in a very unladylike fashion in the middle of Prohibition, right? The picture that I have on the chat for today are two flappers sort of dancing on the edge of a hotel. So I haven't really discouraged that, but I want to temper it now. So were the flappers a real thing? Yeah, of course. There were some flappers. They were mostly young women in cities, and a lot of them sort of gravitated around college. I mean, college was really sort of the place where flappers could be flappers, and they would probably then be flappers in the way that college students are college students, for 4 years. And then you graduate and have families and go do other things. So part of this is overblown as a sort of transitional life phase. I think it's probably true that courtship patterns were changing in the 1920s. There was a lot of talk about the flappers being sort of at the vanguard of new modern sexual mores. Some people who saw this as liberating and some people saw this as threatening. There is some suggestion that courtship patterns and sexual patterns were changing in the 1920s. One historian has written a really fascinating book, and the title of her book really lays out her thesis. It's called From Front Porch to Back Seat. And it indicates how the role of the car in the 1920s revolutionizes courtship. In fact, where men and women literally go from seeing each other on the front porch of the family's house to being alone in this new private space of the automobile, out away from the eyes of the family. That certainly led to new forms of behavior. But were the majority of women flappers? Do flappers represent most women of the 1920s? Not only does what I say no, but I would point out that even in the context of this debate between the ERA on the one hand and the culture of the flappers on the other, and the maternalist or protective legislation people who are activists on the other, the single largest women's organization in the 1920s was not the League of Women Voters. It was not women's labor union. It was not the descendant of the suffrage movement. The single largest women's organization in the 1920s was the Women's Auxiliary to the Ku Klux Klan, the WKKK, which had over 500,000 women enrolled as members over the course of the 1920s. The Women's Auxiliary to the Klan had their own headquarters in Little Rock, Arkansas, and you might think, well, this must be something in the Deep South. No, this was a national organization. Some of the largest chapters were in places like Indiana and Ohio and Pennsylvania. The Klan was not a fringe movement in the 1920s. The Klan was behind the election of a governor in Indiana and was behind the election of a mayor of Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan in the 1920s is the fourth largest city in the country, and its mayor is a Klan affiliate. And it's a northern city. So the Klan is not a marginal presence in life of the 1920s, and it is dedicated to white Protestant Anglo-Saxon ethnic nationalism. Is essentially the platform of the Klan of the 1920s. This is not a private, hidden organization. This is a public organization. They march in public. They hold picnics in public. They put pressure on legislators in public. So a lot of women that were drawn to the Klan, what they were drawn to was the notion of traditional family life, traditional femininity, traditional motherhood, a sort of family life and small town life that was uncorrupted, quote unquote, by foreigners and Catholics and Jews and African Americans and big cities with their jazz and their new morals and all of that. All of that was seen as a threat to an awful lot of people. So again, when we're thinking about women in the 1920s, we're looking at the debate over the ERA. But we need to keep in mind that this does not capture all or even a representative portion of American women in the 1920s. That the real takeaway here is not that flappers come about, suffrage occurs, and all of a sudden we're marching on the vanguard toward equal freedom. It's that tensions erupt. It's that splinters erupt. It's that what Americans had taken for granted as a stable gender identity is suddenly fractured in multiple directions. And that will be the tension that I think we could trace over the rest of the 20th and arguably into the 21st century. So if you have any questions about that debate or about the sources that you're reading for today, send me an email, let me know, or just post your questions in the content of the forum, and maybe we can have a conversation there. Okay, one quick word about tomorrow, because there's just one little difference in the response for tomorrow. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. Everything is pretty much the same in terms of the quiz and the forum, but there is one small additional assignment that I'm asking you to do. It won't take you very long, but I need you to do it so that I can see that you've taken a look at this resource. So going to the sources will be murals that were painted by artists that were receiving public monies to paint murals in post offices around the country. But I also wanted you to compare those post office murals that are in the book with some other painting that was done by artists in the 1930s that were also receiving public monies. And the Smithsonian Institution had one of my favorite art exhibits that I've been to, called 1934, A New Deal for Art. And there's a link on Moodle that takes you to a Flickr site where you can look at all of these paintings. So these were all paintings from the 30s. These were all painters receiving money from the Federal Works Project to do these paintings. And I want you to look at those paintings and compare them to the post office murals. So there is a short little online text box right underneath the link, the Flickr link. And I just ask you to pick your 3 favorite paintings from 1934, A New Deal for Art. So it's not a test exactly. It's just a way for me. There's no really right answer. It's just a way for me to see that you took a look at those paintings and you're going to be thinking about them in relationship to the post office murals. Okay, any questions? Send them my way. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow. All right, bye-bye.